Well, we've been following Joseph. The ups and downs of the life of Joseph, I think, is the title of the whole series. If you imagine a television series that you've been watching, well, this would be the flashback part at the beginning. We've seen Joseph interpreting dreams, given the interpretation for dreams as a young man and getting into trouble with his family, which led to him being sold to the Ishmaelites, who then took him off to Egypt. In Egypt, he was given into the household of Potiphar, but things went wrong there after he'd proved himself to be very useful, and he faced temptation, as we heard from Daniel, but also he was sent to prison unfairly. In prison, he met the cupbearer and the baker and was given accurate interpretations for them, and he asked the cupbearer, who was going to go back into service for Pharaoh, "Will you remember me, please, when you get to see Pharaoh?" But we ended last week on the words with chapter 40, verse 23 of last week, where the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So that's the real pits, isn't it? He's at the really low point. He's been there in prison. And we start today's service message with Genesis 41, verse 1. And the words say, "When 2 full years had passed." I love the fact it doesn't say after a short time, or it doesn't say after 2 years. It says 2 full years, 2 whole years. There's a sense of feeling in there, isn't there, that it's a long time. Now, I know for some of you who've been waiting for things, 2 years isn't a long while, but you put yourself in his position. He's there. He was hoping very much that the cupbearer would put in a word for him with Pharaoh, and he hasn't any idea of when he's going to get out of the prison that he's in. He's got no control over his situation. He has an unknown release date. That's a very difficult place to be in. But the Bible is full of people who have to wait long times. We know that Abraham had to wait many years before he had the promise of a son. Paul had to wait a long time of imprisonment before he could get on with his ministry. And Jesus had to wait 30 years before he even started his earthly ministry. So waiting is something that happens. And twice in our series already, the preachers have referred to Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, which says, "All things work together for the good of those who love him." God works all things together for good. But I want to go on to the next verse, because it follows by saying that those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. God can transform us through our difficulties. We've already sung and prayed about the fact that sometimes in our darkest moments are the times when, by our wills, we will listen to God and give him praise. God can transform us and change us even in the difficulties. Our Laura Jenkins writes poems, and in her book, Penned in Love, I found this particular phrase: "You come out of the waiting different than before, like a butterfly emerging, stretching its wings. You take with you the lessons you've been taught and how to see his goodness through it all." That will take our wills to do that, to wait patiently and to be positive in the waiting. That's as we see Joseph as an individual, his own personal life. But if you remember back to Phil's sermon, he talked about the fact that there are different scales of maps. And here we have the personal life of Joseph, but also we have God's plan for his people. And when we see these 2 years in the plan for the whole people of God, those 2 years were very important. If the cupbearer hadn't remembered him early, then where would he have been? He would have been back in what he called the land of the Hebrews, where in fact he'd been forcibly taken from. So he wouldn't have been where he was needed to be to fulfill God's will. Now I'm going to give a spoiler alert, sorry Matt, but next week we'll hear about the fact that in Genesis 45, Joseph explains to his brothers, God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save you your lives by a great deliverance. That's what's going to happen. That's the plan that God has. It's a much bigger plan than Joseph's own individual comfort. And sometimes we have to trust God for that bit too. When our lives are in a difficult situation, we may have to think about the fact that God may have a bigger plan here than just our individual lives. So let's go on with the story. Pharaoh had a dream. But then verse 8 says, in the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then, and this is the part, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Now, it was because Pharaoh Sesostris I had these two dreams, and none of his wise men could interpret them. And suddenly the cupbearer remembers who he met in prison and what had happened there. But rather than be cross with the cupbearer, which Joseph might have been, let's remember what happened to him. He left the prison behind, and he became busy again. He became a cupbearer. He had a really important part in Pharaoh's household. And his busyness and in the pressures of his life, he put these things behind him, and he forgot. Now, I hate to say the COVID word, but if you remember, go back to COVID, if you remember promising yourself that you wouldn't get so busy afterwards, that you'd keep taking those walks, you'd keep spending time with your friends or family that you couldn't see at that point. You'd keep having longer times with God. And what about now? Now that life has got back to normal. We can get too busy. We can forget things. And that's really important. We know that people let us down, like the cupbearer let Joseph down. But we also know that we forget important things, and we need to be able to put them right. So the cupbearer, when he remembered, he wanted to please Pharaoh. I don't know if he felt guilty or not, but his reasoning was to please Pharaoh here and get in his good books. He may have felt guilty because he does say, my shortcomings. And he's able now to put them right. So I've this morning put a situation that apparently I didn't do, I know I didn't do, a year ago. A year ago, Joyce had her 80th birthday, and a custom is that we would give flowers on the 80th birthday. So if you've had your 80th and I haven't given flowers, I apologize, but I knew about Joyce's and I forgot. I feel pleased this morning that I've been able to put that right. I've been able to wait for her to finish her cruise and then be able to give her flowers. I'm only 1 year late, but it's good to have done it. So I would invite you to let God speak into your mind. Are there things that because of your busyness you've forgotten to do? Are there promises you've made and you haven't kept? Promises are so important. So the cupbearer explained to Pharaoh, I met this man in prison, and he explained to me, and he gave this interpretation of dreams to me and the baker, and they were accurate. So why don't we fetch him now? So now the story of Joseph, from going from the depths where we started this morning to going up. We're on the rise. So verse 14 says, So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought out from the dungeon. When he'd shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Things changed in an instant. We've already heard once this morning about how things can change quickly. Joseph could not change his situation. He couldn't get out of the prison, but God could, and God did. And when we think about Jesus, when he started his earthly ministry, he gave his mandate in Luke 4. When he was reading from Isaiah, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me," that is on Jesus, "because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, and he sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." I wonder what prisons you are in this morning. Are they emotional prisons, circumstantial, physical? Have you been the cause of them, or are you in that situation unfairly? I believe, like Joseph, that God can and will set you free. You may be in a waiting situation. I'm very glad that our church runs Freedom in Christ courses. They are an excellent opportunity for people to meet with God and for him to be able to set them free from all sorts of things. So what happens to Joseph? Well, suddenly everything changes, and he's given a shave, and he's given a clean up. No wonder. Can you imagine how he would have been in that dungeon situation? He needed to have a clean shave and a clean and a wash and a change of clothes. I find it interesting with God's timing how things can happen very quickly for us. The one situation I can think of for me personally was when we were in Brazil, and that's my husband and I, and we went on a temporary visa, but we needed a permanent visa to be able to go in and out of the country. After 2 years, when we were hoping to come home for a holiday, the permanent visa still hadn't been granted. And then after 4 years, at the point when we were just about to fly home, we heard that our paperwork had moved from Brasilia, from the justice courts there, to São Paulo. Well, we decided we would stay because that was a step closer to us getting them. And so we stayed probably for about another month, I would think. But we had a definite date when we had to leave because I was pregnant and I wasn't allowed to fly after a certain day. I can remember one night, my husband and I spending time really praying and shouting out to God because there wasn't anything we could do about the situation. We couldn't get that visa to us any quicker. But then, the next day, we got a phone call from the police to say, "Come to the police station." Again, we were told, "Don't get your hopes up, you'll just join a queue." But when we got to the queue, because I was pregnant, we went to the front of the queue, and we got our permanent visa. What I find really interesting about that is that God didn't call us back to Brazil. So we didn't ever use the permanent visa. But it taught me so much about how we need to rely on God. And when he brings things together, things can change quickly. So let's go on with our story with Joseph. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I've had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Listen to Joseph's response. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Joseph knew that it wasn't him that had the ability to do the interpretation, but he was able to relay it. He was able to do it. And he'd actually said that to the cupbearer and the baker before. He said, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" So God is not only a giver of the dream, but he was also a source of their interpretation. Now, in the story of Joseph, this is the third time we've come across dreams. So I feel it's right to perhaps take a little pause and to think about dreams for a minute. Now, we're told that dreams are a very natural part of life. We all dream. We may not remember them, but we all do it. They can be caused by all sorts of things, by stress and concern, or excitement? It was just this week that my daughter Naomi sent me a text saying, I dreamt I was at a Take That concert. I think it's because she's waiting to go in June, with me, I might say. So, yes, dreams can be caused by excitement. I'm also told that they can be caused by overindulgence in cheese or wine. So not all dreams are alike. There's a phrase from that well-known musical that we've talked about before, that any dream will do. But I don't agree with that. There are dreams and dreams. There are those nonsense dreams that really shouldn't occupy our time and our thoughts. There are those dreams that come along that are really not meaningful. But I was recommended, in fact, he came here to speak a long time ago, this book, Find Your Voice, by David Oliver. And in it, he has 2 chapters about dreams. The book is under the title, Developing the Prophetic in You and Your Church. And I think that's quite a clue there, that the dreams and prophetic are linked together. So he explains in one particular passage, which I find really fascinating. He said that Einstein was inspired to discover the theory of relativity through a dream. Niels Bohr came up with the quantum theory after a dream. Bernard Mathias, no, I don't know if that's related, but anyway, he invented the superconductor in his sleep. And Newton, Edison, Goodyear all received insights in their sleep for their discoveries and inventions, and they've affected many lives, haven't they? So there are important dreams that God gives or that are given to people, and they use them. And we know that there are dreams in the Bible. There are about 21, apparently, throughout the Bible. Many of them are in the Old Testament. We've now seen 3 times that they come up in Joseph's life. But also they happen to Jacob and to Daniel, to Solomon, Nebuchadnezzar, many other people. Sometimes they're symbolic, and sometimes they give explicit instructions. So we also know that there were dreams at the birth of Jesus. Joseph took Mary to be his wife, which was very much against his own judgment, because she was pregnant and he wasn't the father. But because of the dream, he took her for his wife. The Magi didn't return to Herod because they were told in a dream not to. And Joseph was given explicit instructions to take his family to Egypt to escape Herod. And then we have a bit further on in Acts when the Holy Spirit came in a very special way on the day of Pentecost. And Peter was quoting Joel in his sermon to the people there. And he said, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. But sometimes I think over the ages as Christians, we forget things or they become dulled. Interesting use of the word earlier. Maybe we've fallen into the trap of thinking that God doesn't speak through those dreams as he did in the past. Perhaps they're like the dodo, they're extinct. But we know that God can still speak through dreams today. And even while I was preparing for this talk, a fortnight ago, Sue, if you'd like to come up now, Sue spoke to us in the pastoral team. This was just 2 weeks ago, and I asked her if she'd be prepared to come and share.
Can I?
Yeah, in the middle.
Can I just say that the night before the dream, I wasn't excited. I hadn't had cheese and I hadn't had wine. But it was 3 weeks ago, actually. It was very, very clear. And I sensed God say in my dream, someone in church is going to need a new armchair because theirs is going to get spoilt at midweek group. So I thought, okay. And then in my dream, I was then walking alongside the river, and I saw Maggie, and she'd got this big armchair, like a snuggle seat, and she was manoeuvring it, trying to get it out of this building. And I said, "Oh, hi, Maggie." And she said, "Oh, hi, Sue. Someone in church needs a new armchair, so that's what I'm kind of doing." So I said, "Oh, my goodness, Maggie, God told me, I sense God told me in my dream that someone would need an armchair." Anyway, the building to the right was where she'd got the chair from. And the windows were a little bit, and it's interesting, Nikki, what you just shared. The windows were quite grubby, and the building was stacked high with furniture, but it was just a bit grubby. And I could see the underneath bit of this snuggle chair that Maggie had got, and it was there was cobwebs, and it was just a little bit dirty. So anyway, then in my dream, on this side, I saw another building. I also saw you, Martin, standing there. And you weren't helping, Martin. You weren't helping. He was just standing watching, which was interesting. But anyway, this building then to the left was the total opposite. And I could see in through the windows because it was so bright. It was so bright. I could see these gold armchairs that were really opulent, and there were gold price tags on them. And that it was the light that was so incredible. And I heard 3 words. I sensed God said, "Centre of Excellence." And I felt that was a word for us as a church. That in everything we do, it's not just the make, do, and mend, or the second class kind of stuff, but actually to be excellent in all we do. In our leadership, in our teaching, in the projects that are going on. I was thinking about Breathe, the ministry to the children, the lunches that we put on for newcomers. Everything that we do would be excellent. And the other part of the dream was I saw this great big smile. And when I was growing up, there used to be a toothpaste advert where you saw a great big smile, perfect teeth, with a bright, shiny tooth. And the light of that tooth just lit up the whole picture. And I felt that was God's smile over this, what will become a centre of excellence.
Thank you, Sue. Now, I have to be honest with you and say when I heard Sue give that word, I thought, oh, I'm dealing in the old armchair. That's what I do. I do the old things, and yet there are these beautiful new things there, and I'm doing the old. And I felt a bit, because I just sort of felt I'm out of sync with this new, is what I felt. And then I can't remember who I told it to, but I told them that vision. They said, no, I don't see it like that. I see it as you're bringing out the old to make way for the new. And I suddenly thought, oh, it's completely different to what I thought. And that made me realize, actually, I was bringing to that, hearing that vision, I was bringing my own insecurities, my own concepts and precepts, which Dave knows I fight against. I'm out of step. And he keeps saying, Maggie! And he's right. But that's what I was doing with that dream. So when I look at myself and my own interpretation and my own things, then I'm in trouble. Then we need to come to God, and that's what we need to do with dreams. So when God gives us a dream, we know it's from him. So what would I do if I knew that God was giving me a dream? Well, first of all, I'd write it down, because these things can disappear quite quickly. Then I would pray about it. Then I would share it. And I would share it within the fellowship here, the community of the church. I would look for those people who are living their faith. I would look for those people who seem to have a prophetic understanding. And I would be asking them, not for their interpretation, but for them to help me seek God's interpretation for that dream. So I would say to you, be open. Let's be open to God speaking to us through dreams. He cuts against even our arguments. He cuts against our natural opinions. We can't interfere when God speaks to us in a dream. But I would also say a warning, not to get put overemphasis on dreams. There is today a very great deal talked about dreams in our modern culture. They can be a source of entertainment and self-reflection. And I know that they can be used in some therapies, but we're all unique, and we need to be guard against our over-interest in them. You will know, as soon you, if God is speaking to you through a dream. But when we want to hear God's word, we need to keep reading our Bibles, keep talking to him in prayer. So let's go back to the story, and let's go back to the dream that Pharaoh had. So he explains to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. And I'd never seen such ugly cows in all of the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up." He goes on. "Then in my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads." What could it have meant? Well, Pharaoh said that he was standing on the bank of the river Nile, and that the cows were coming up out of the Nile. Now, Egypt has a very hot desert climate, and certainly in those times, they were dependent on the river overflowing at certain times of the year. Again, as I was preparing this, we in Shrewsbury, here in our particular church, are very good at watching river levels. We know the difference between 4.5 meters and 4.8 meters. Well, in Egypt, they knew the difference between 18 inches, between 5 cubits. Sorry, get it right, Maggie. They knew the difference between 15 cubits, which is just short of 7 meters, when there was plenty, or 12 meters, when there was, I've got that completely wrong again. So, anyway, they were looking at the cubits. They were looking, if it rose to 15 cubits, then they were in plenty. But it was only 12 cubits or under, there was scarcity. I should read my notes, but I'm trying to do it from memory. And even today, there are annual variations in the River Nile. And cultivation depends on the overflowing and the water that's there. So out of the river came the cows, and out of the river came the stalks of grain. So it was very important that that was the abundance, that was where God would bless them. And very clearly, Joseph was able to give the meaning of the dreams. Then verse 25 says, "Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, 'The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that come up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine.'" When I think about it, the meaning becomes quite clear then, doesn't it? With the river being so important, and these things coming out of the river, and you've got the fat and then the thin, and then the famine comes along. God was very gracious to give Pharaoh this warning, to give the people of Egypt that warning. But it's interesting that if I think it's clear and obvious, Pharaoh's magicians and wise men, they couldn't give the interpretation. The meaning was hidden so that God would be given the greater glory. But Joseph didn't only give the interpretation, but he also knew how to put it into action. He gave some very detailed, smart objectives to Pharaoh. He said, first of all, you need somebody to oversee the work. And then you need commissioners who will collect a fifth of the harvest and store it in what they're called cities of food. So you can imagine the quantity. And then that food will be reserved for the famine. So Joseph had the interpretation and he had the how to put it into action. So we go on with the story. Verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh said, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Now Joseph was obviously a capable person, but what Pharaoh comments is one in whom is the Spirit of God. We are told that when we become Christians, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we're told that God sets his seal of ownership on us and he puts his Spirit in our hearts as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. When we have the Spirit, as we've heard this morning in our worship time, that leads to repentance so we can say, Abba, Father. But it leads us to hope and to purpose too. We have the Spirit of God in us if we believe. What can other people see in us of the Spirit of God? Now, you may not think you're like Joseph. You're not very capable. You're not very able like he was. We're not all destined to become prime ministers. But not many people have heard of Mordecai Ham. But it was through his ministry that Billy Graham became a Christian. And he was probably the greatest evangelist of the 20th century. Whoever you are, God can and will use you. And his Spirit in you will not only bless you and us as a church, but all those that you will go out to. We had a word from Kate last week in our service, which said that we don't have to strive to be a light. We are light, because Jesus, the light of the world, lives in us. So wherever we go, we take him. So I'm looking forward to next week, to the culmination of our series, the outworking of the interpretations, and so much more. But what have we learnt today? First of all, that God can use our difficult situations to make us more like him. We need to wait positively. And no matter the prison that we find ourselves in, God is in control. His timing is perfect. And he does set people free. We also learn we can put things right that we've forgotten in the past. So we must ask God to help us to remember them. And please remember that God can use our dreams to speak to us even today and to move us on in our lives. We need to be open to that. And we need to realize that wherever we go, we take God's Spirit with us, and he will bless others through us. Thank you.